This is Research Like a Pro, episode 256, Alford Johnson Research, interview with James Johnson. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the authors of Research Like a Pro, a genealogist guide. With Robin Worthland, they also co-authored the companion volume, Research Like a Pro with DNA. Join Diana and Nicole as they discuss how to stay organized, make progress in their research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go! Today's episode is sponsored by newspapers.com. Break down genealogy brick walls with a subscription to the largest online newspaper archive. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Research Like a Pro.
Hi, Nicole. How are you doing today?
Great. I've been making great progress on my Dyer research project. How about you?
Well, I've been trying to work on my Royston research project, but I keep getting interrupted with other things. Imagine that. But I did want to talk for a minute about the part I read in the book that I am reading. Everybody knows I love the Brooks Blevins books, History of the Ozarks, and I'm right in the middle of Volume 2, which is all about the Civil War. And it's right there in northern Arkansas and southern Missouri. So I thought this was such an interesting statement where he says this is after the Battle of Pea Ridge, which is like the major battle that took place there in northern Arkansas. But after that, he says, it was an unqualified victory for the smaller Army of the Southwest, one of immense strategic importance, for it solidified Missouri's status as a Union state and secured it against the threat of an invading Confederate army capable of accomplishing meaningful military and political objectives. Henceforth, Confederate efforts in the Ozarks of southern Missouri would be limited to periodic raids and the disruptive activities and depredations of bands of irregulars. So when I read that, I thought, oh my goodness, that is exactly what we have learned as we've studied our ancestors who lived through that it was this continual kind of guerrilla warfare where little bands would descend from different factions of both Confederates and Union armies and just completely disrupted and destroyed the people's lives and their livelihood, burning the farms, taking everything that they had. So I am just really enjoying this little step back into history and imagining our ancestors living through that.
It's hard to imagine, isn't it? It helps, though, to read the book and to understand for that specific locality what exactly they might have gone through.
Yeah, it really does. And I'm just getting so many little tidbits. I don't usually mark up my books. This is a nice hardcover copy, but I have my red pencil out and I am marking it up because it's pretty dense with such good information. And like when I come to something that I really want to maybe return to or use in a research report or a biography of our ancestors, I'm marking it up. So I feel like that's a good use of my red pencil in this book.
Fun. Well, for our announcements today, our June Research Like a Pro webinar is going to be by Diana. She'll be presenting about Elijah Dillard and if he is the brother of Cynthia Dillard Royston. And it's a DNA case study. So if you haven't joined our Research Like a Pro webinar series yet, we invite you to sign up for that. You can watch all of the previous month recordings and you can attend the Zoom lecture live or watch the recording as well. The next Research Like a Pro study group will begin in August, and we'll be having registration starting soon. So make sure you get into our newsletter so you can get those reminders.
Well, thank you for going through those. I just wanted to make a note that I'm doing the Dillard case because someone specifically said, I want to hear you talk about your Cynthia Dillard project. And so I will be doing kind of a recap of my research to date with Cynthia and then talking about Elijah, who I discovered through DNA. And so that's going to be a fun webinar. Well, today we are excited to have a guest with us. We have James Wesley Johnson. Welcome, James.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're so excited to talk with you all about your research and an exciting discovery that you made in your family. So I'm just going to let you introduce that.
Okay.
Let's just say that this was a 120-year family secret. So tell us all about how that happened.
Yeah, like most secrets, you don't know what you're getting into till you get into it. So early in 1980, my father, who really didn't know his father since he was 6 years old when his mother separated from him, decided he wanted to find his father. And by doing that, he had to, ask his mom who his dad was, what the names were. He got a couple of names. He got his dad's names, James Howard Johnson, and his grandfather's name, Charles Johnson. But he didn't know where they were from. He knew they were from Arkansas, but back then you didn't have Ancestry or Find a Grave or Family Search. You mostly had what were called bulletin boards and list servers, CDs from the library, that kind of thing. And my dad got in touch with a lady who was actually going to grave sites and writing down names. And she came across a really small cemetery in West Arkansas at Westline, and it had Charles Johnson. It was CHS period Johnson. She said, I don't know if this is who you're looking for, but right next to him is another guy who has your name, James William Johnson. Well, that was intriguing enough for my dad to get in the car with his wife and drive out to Westline from Florida. And they found it. It was a grave, really small, in the middle of nowhere, West Arkansas. There were a lot of Johnsons there. There was James Johnson, Sarah Johnson, many of them that he never even heard about. And somebody who lived near the gravesite walked up and said, are you related to the Johnsons? He said, yeah, my name's James William Johnson. He goes, well, you got some cousins down the road. So he took a road that was paved and then it turned dirt road and it was pretty far back in the woods. Now he's from Arkansas himself, middle Arkansas. So driving down dirt roads was nothing to him, but his wife was getting a little concerned about it. But he came across Charles Johnson, who was sitting on his front porch with a shotgun leaning against the wall. And they pulled up, and his dad describes it. The chickens and the pigs kind of ran away. And his wife said, I'm not getting out of the car. So he got out of the car. He goes, I'll do this. And he walked up and Charles said, who are you? And he said, my name is James William Johnson, which made Charles stand up and said, what'd you say? And he told him his name again. He goes, who's your dad? And he said, James Howard Johnson. Wait a minute. You're Howard's boy? Mildred, get out here. It's Howard's boy. So now he was part of the family real quick. Charles had a bunch of Johnson names and phone numbers and knew Howard Johnson, knew his dad's mom. So coming from that, Dad was able to get back home and start calling all these Johnsons who were scattered across the country. Some of them in Mississippi, some of them in California, some of them in Oregon. They were just everywhere, Arizona. And he started interviewing. And that's really how this whole thing kind of started.
Oh my goodness. I am just envisioning that moment on the front porch with the gun and just the whole countenance of Charles Johnson changing when he found out who it actually was. That's such a great story. I love that. So fun.
It's very Southern.
That's awesome. Makes me a little worried about trying to track down some of my ancestors in Arkansas and their places. Oh my goodness.
If you need some assistance, Dad's pretty good at it.
That's so neat, James. Can you tell us more about these interviews that you had with family members?
Absolutely. So Dad started asking questions, mainly still trying to track down his dad. And while he was talking to him, he found out that his grandfather's father was James William Johnson, just like the gravesite said. So that's who my father was obviously named after. And that he had two known siblings, Uncle Dick Johnson, his name was Joseph Richard Johnson, and Aunt Belle from Texas. Everybody knew Aunt Belle. Everybody knew that was, I'm going to refer to the older James William as JW. Everyone knew that was JW's sister and that they were all from Tennessee. I want to preface these interviews with, there were a lot of other interviews that were outlandish. Like my dad's grandfather died wrestling a bear. There were all these, kind of crazy stories. So when I tell you these particular interviews, it sounds like, well, why didn't, this makes a lot of sense, but you kind of had to take some of this information out and figure out what was real, what wasn't. Because there was a rumor that Uncle Dick got in trouble with the law and he and JW got run out of Tennessee for horse thieving. That was just, interview off to the side with one person. Nobody else confirmed it or knew anything about it. So it was just kind of one of those, you just kind of, maybe so. And one of the interviews was, he was part of the Jesse James gang. Okay. So you kind of had to like really weigh what people were saying to you. So unfortunately, nobody knew anybody further back than JW, Aunt Belle, and Uncle Dick. So then Dad decided, he went to Tennessee to try to see if he could find them in Rowan County, and there were no Johnsons that fit any descriptions of these guys. So he was kind of at a loss and decided to go collaterally with the brothers and sisters. He started with Aunt Belle, who lived in Dallas, and he found her obituary. But instead of her being born in Tennessee, she was born in Illinois, which really confused him. And he'd go back to those interviews and go back, talk to them. And they all said, no, she's from Tennessee. We all know she's from Tennessee. Okay, so then he decided he'd already gotten JW's death certificate, who, by the way, his father was listed as Robert Johnson from Tennessee. And he got Aunt Belle's death certificate, which listed her father as unknown Alford. And that was the first time we ever saw that word. So then he decided to get her marriage license. And on the marriage license, it listed her maiden name, which was Susan Isabel Alford. Now, not only was he confused, but so were all the Johnsons. And some of them were saying that all the records were wrong. There was a lot of, confusion. So since she was from Macoupin County, Illinois, he decided to look at census records there. Now, by now, it was kind of easier to get census records online. Things were starting to move a little bit better. This was like 98, 99. Things were a little bit better. So he did find a census record from Macoupin County with a family of Robert, since JW's father was Robert, but it was Robert Alford. And in that list was a Susan Alford. And there were several other siblings. This was the 1870 census. There was a Patrick Alford, there was a Tom Alford, there was a George Alford. Patrick Alford would have been about 9 years old. And JW's birth was 1860, but it was July. So when he went to the census, Patrick wasn't there. This was before we realized that the census was taken in June 1st and he was born in July, so he wouldn't be listed. So we were still pretty confused. Now, I want to go back to the interviews. There was one interview that talked about JW's fourth child, Elsie Jane. When Sarah Jane gave birth to her, Sarah Jane passed away. So the story was that there was this really nice lady from Texas named Rebecca, or Becky, and she took the child and wet nursed her in Texas, which, that happens. Strangers, friends do that. But it's really kind of more of a sibling thing. And as it turned out, Becky had a son at the same time. So her name was Rebecca McFadden. And this is another little key though, in one of the address books of one of the Johnsons, their parent had written Becky McFadden and in parentheses, Alford. So that we didn't understand that either. Like, okay, well, was she part of this deal too? And there was a Rachel in the census. So he did what any good genealogist did. He got on the phone and called information. He called Arlington Information. Now, luckily, McFadden was spelled kind of uniquely. It was McFadin. So he asked her, and he goes, there's several of them, and gave him about 10 names, and he started calling. Well, about the third call, there was a guy who said, you know what? I know what you're talking about, and I don't have the answers, but I know someone who does. And he gave him the phone number of Margaret McFadden. So Dad called Margaret McFadden and said, my name's James William Johnson, and I'm researching my family, and I keep coming across this name Alford, and I'm just wondering if you know anything about that. Well, Margaret broke down in tears. She started crying. She said, I thought I was going to die before anybody would come ask. Mm-hmm. So she said, hold on a second. She went to her closet, got a box out, and started telling Dad the story of the fact that JW was actually Patrick Alford and had changed his name because he and his two brothers had gotten in trouble with the law in Texas, not Tennessee. it was really interesting. She would talk about Patrick and JW, and she would mix in the word Mace. And Dad would have to stop her and say, well, who's Mace? Well, that's Patrick. It's Patrick Mace Alford. She said it was his middle name. We kind of think so, too. We really have no proof of that. But Dad heard the story of the name change. He got a lot of information out of Margaret. They stayed in touch. And, of course, all this time, he and I are kind of going over the records, and he's showing me. I wasn't interested at first. Now I'm interested. So then Dad called me up one day and said, I want you to do me a favor. And I said, what? He goes, I want you to Google Mace Alford. And this is like 2000. Google was actually working by then. And I typed in Mace Alford, and up came this modern day article out of Fort Worth called Bad Guys Win the Day. And it was all about a gunfight, these horse thieves named Tom, Mace, and George. And that the deputy sheriff, that's how this one described it, was shot in a gunfight. And the bad guys, one of them got arrested, but he got off on quote unquote technicalities. All right, now I'm super excited because now I got outlaws, Wild West outlaws in my family. This is pretty good. So we got in touch with the guy who wrote the article, and he got us in touch with a historian at Fort Worth who had been researching this from the newspapers. He also gave us a Texas appeals court decision that allowed us to read that too. So now we have a better picture of this whole thing. This is how the whole court case went down with the Alfords. Tom had a horse and he sold it to a guy, and somebody said that's a stolen horse, took it from him. The guy who said it was his horse said that he got an indictment out for a John Smith. Now, there's some little argument on whether or not that's like a John Doe or not, but there were like 13 John Smiths in the county, so it might have legitimately been a John Smith. This warrant was handed to a young man who really wanted to be a police officer but wasn't, and he wasn't sworn in as a deputy sheriff. He was just giving it to him and said, go find him. And he was smart enough to follow the fellow that bought the horse back to Arlington from Fort Worth and found Tom, George, and Mace. He arrested Tom, tied him up, said he had a warrant for his arrest, but what he had was a warrant for John Smith, which he took a pen and wrote through and put Tom Alford on it, and started on their way. But Tom wanted to get his clothes, so Patrick went back to get his clothes, and he and a friend of theirs, Bill Lytle, came back, and the kid jumped off, and guns started firing, and the young kid died, and so did their friend Bill Lytle. Tom, George, and Mace got away. George got arrested, went to trial, was convicted of murder. It went to the state appeals court, and they overturned it, basically because the warrant was wrong. The guy wasn't a police officer. And if you try to arrest somebody and you don't have the right rights to do that, that's not arresting somebody, that's false imprisonment or kidnapping. And you have the right, especially in Texas, to rescue somebody who's been falsely imprisoned. And if the level of violence raises to gunfight, you can get away with shooting somebody. And it was Bill Lytle's gun that shot the kid, and the kid shot Bill Lytle. Tom received a bullet wound in his back, but it's unclear whether or not Mace shot his gun or not. So the case went back to the courts, and George was let off. That wasn't the real problem. The real problem is the Alfords came from Illinois, and this is 1880 in Texas, right after Reconstruction, and all of the ex-Confederates that actually fought in the war were really in charge. The marshal was ex-Confederate, the sheriff was ex-Confederate, the judge was ex-Confederate, the mayor was ex-Confederate. And when they started canvassing the area, even though the Alfords would claim they were from Tennessee, which originally Robert Alford was, word got out that they were from Illinois. And once that happened, that family, some of this came from Margaret. They couldn't sell their goods. They couldn't buy groceries. They couldn't socialize. They couldn't go to church. So the girls all married off and changed their names. Elsie, the mother, took the youngest back to Tennessee where her family was. And Patrick and George changed their name and moved to West Arkansas, next to a town called Ultimatula, which actually means the end of the world. And it literally is. There's nothing there. and it's on the border of Oklahoma, Indian Territory. Kind of the perfect place to hide out and start a new life.
Wow, this is such an interesting story, and I love the fact that you brought in that conflict between the ex-Confederates and the ex-Union soldiers there in Texas, because that was a real thing. And it makes perfect sense that they would have to change their identity and become somebody different. I was just curious how many years this all took, from the beginning of your dad ending up on that porch and finding the family, to where you are
Yeah.
actually researching the court case.
So Dad started looking for his father in 1982. But, research in 1982 is slow and difficult. I mean, if you want a death certificate, you basically had to call the court, find out how much it was, go get a registered check, put it in the mail, send it to them, let them look it up, mail it back to you. And it was 3 months before you would even hear anything. And either they would go, oh, we couldn't find it. Here's your check back. Or here it is. So a lot of that documentary research in the early goings were really slow and meticulous. You didn't just go to a database and search for it like you can today. So, Dad's got a lot of those original ones that came in the mail, and now they're all on Ancestry. He didn't put them there.
Yes.
So he ended up on Charles's porch in 1998.
Oh, he
So,
did research for a
and
long time trying to figure this
yeah.
out. Yeah.
Well, the whole idea of the Alford situation, though, I mean, he was up to 1998, he was just trying to find the Johnsons.
Yeah.
And then things started happening really fast once that happened, mostly because there was a small reunion in 2000 of all the Johnsons. They wanted to meet Dad because he was bugging them on the phone. So they wanted to finally meet him face to face. But things started happening pretty fast once he started seeing the name Alford, and especially when he got the marriage license of Bell and reconciled that with the census record in Macoupin County, Illinois, of Robert Alford in 1870.
That was a key record. And because he had done the research, he had something to put that together with. He could do some correlation there.
Well, it made the interview with Margaret make so much more sense.
Yeah.
Because Margaret kind of filled in a lot of the holes. Now, there's a couple other things that were interesting. I mentioned that Rachel Rebecca wet nursed Elsie, JW's daughter. There was a census record in 1900s when that happened that lists Elsie Jane in the house of the McFadens as Janie Alford. Because she was really an Alford because JW was Patrick Alford and Rebecca was his sister.
That Alford name just kept popping up.
It certainly did.
Could not ignore that.
That's so amazing that all these little clues in the census records and things finally came together when your dad was able to interview Margaret McFadden.
Yes.
How great that she had that information just waiting to share that.
Let me say something about that. That is great because her husband was in the military. So she had been all over the world with that cardboard box, going from place to place, always keeping it. And here was the deal. She told them that she had promised her mother that she would never reveal to any of the Johnsons that they were Alfords unless a Johnson came and specifically asked about the Alford name.
Huh. Well, now that your dad figured out the secret, did he feel obligated to share that with the rest of the Johnson family?
Yes. So we actually organized another reunion in 2002. And about that time, Apple had like iMovie and that kind of thing where you could create DVDs. And I was pretty good at creating presentations and stuff. So I created a presentation on iMovie that actually broke down the whole thing. At this point, we had enough old pictures of the family that we were able to kind of put it together really nicely and tell the story. But I remember the day we presented that, and Dad and I were so nervous. I mean, here we are, really estranged from the Johnsons, right? And they have all their lives been told they were Johnsons and never knew this story. And from our perspective, it didn't have the emotional impact that it was going to have on them. And the closer we got to that day of revealing it, the more worried we were that they were just going to say, get back in your car and leave. Um, and a couple of them didn't believe it, and still to this day don't. But most of them were like, this makes so much sense. And then they go to explain, one day Elsie Jane and her husband were visiting us. Her husband said, you do know your last name's not supposed to be Johnson. And she didn't know what he was talking about. She said, what's it supposed to be? And she remembered him saying Buford. So there were all these little things that kind of came out after the reveal that connected the dots for the family and made a lot of sense.
Yeah, that one clue that didn't make sense, all of a sudden, with the full story, people start to connect the dots.
That's right.
I think that's so interesting. And we are seeing that a lot with DNA now. We're going to talk about DNA in a bit with this case. But so many times people will say, yeah, I just never felt like I was a Johnson, for example. Right. I didn't look like anybody else. I didn't fit in with them. So I think it's a very interesting thing that sometimes there are these little questions.
I do want to throw this in before we go on to DNA. It was pretty impactful, the whole thing with me. And the stories about Aunt Belle, she was a pretty independent person. And the things that went on that she did for the family and with the family, she was a family hero, basically. My wife and I adopted twins out of Fort Worth, of all places, where the guys got in trouble. So I talked my wife into naming their middle name after Susan. So one of them is Michaela Isabel Johnson, and the other one's Mackenzie Susan Johnson.
Oh, that's really neat.
Well, kind of carrying on the tradition, if you look at the names of the Alford family before the name change, the Johnsons have the same given names.
Yeah, those names were important. They had to keep something of their past.
Yeah.
Since they couldn't keep the surname, they kept their first names and middle names. That's great. Well, let's take a break and do a word from our sponsor, newspapers.com. Did your ancestor disappear from vital records? Maybe they moved or got married. Newspapers.com can help you find them and tell their stories. Or have you ever had trouble figuring out how people tie into your family tree? Newspapers are filled with birth notices, marriage announcements, and obituaries. Items like these are a great resource for determining family relationships. On newspapers.com, you can explore more than 800 million newspaper pages from across the US, UK, Canada, and beyond in just seconds. Their easy-to-use search feature lets you filter your results by date, location, a specific paper, and more. When you find something interesting, the newspapers.com clipping tool makes it a snap to share it with family and friends. You can even save it directly to your ancestry tree. For listeners of this podcast, newspapers.com is offering new subscribers 20% off a Publisher Extra subscription so you can start exploring today. Just use the code Family Locket at checkout. Well, James, you wrote a book about this. Not necessarily about the reveal, but about that gunfight, and I love the looks of it. It is titled A Horse, a Gunfight, and the Law, a historical account of our Alfords in Texas, and it's on Amazon. I love the cover. It just looks fascinating. So tell us a little bit more about the book.
So we had decided we were going to write a book, probably late 2000s. And it was probably going to be more like the narrative I just gave. But another book came out called Written in Blood. And it was actually written by that historian from Fort Worth Police Department, who was retired at the time. And he had a chapter called Deputy Marshal George White, who was the young man who arrested Tom. And his narrative read a little more like Louis L'Amour and really kind of made it sound like our guys got off on really light technicalities and something simple. So we decided to actually tell that story in more detail because we thought we owed it to the family to understand legally what had happened and how it happened. And we even consulted, there's another fellow podcaster named Ken Wise. He's a sitting appellate court judge in Texas. And he does Wise About Texas, where he talks about Texas history. So I got in touch with him and kind of told him a little bit of the story and asked him to review the case and tell me if he thought it was technical or not. He goes, "No, this is not technical. These are United States federal rights that everyone should have." So at that point, we decided to really tell the story from the family, all the way from where they started in Tennessee to where they ended up in Texas and what had happened, and then what had happened afterwards. And in that, I had to do a lot of what you guys would call fan research, where I went and looked at where they came from in East Tennessee. And they moved to Macoupin County before the Civil War. And I'm from Tennessee, and I took Tennessee history, and I was never taught some of this. East Tennessee was a big unionist, anti-slave area. Actually, a lot of the big abolitionists came out of East Tennessee in the 1820s. They got run out of there, but most of East Tennessee wanted to stay in the Union and were not very pro-slavery. There were a lot of reasons for that. Most of it was economical because most of these farmers had to compete with free labor. And before the war broke out, all of the Alfords and about 3 other families migrated to Macoupin County, Illinois, over a time period from 1845 to 1858, just before the war. And of the Alfords, a lot of Patrick's cousins, about 4 or 5 of them, and one of his uncles fought for the Union in the war. And the Robert family lived there from 1858 to 1875, 76. And I think that by then they thought the animosity and things like that would have been gone. And they had a cousin living in Arlington, and Arlington was just starting up. And they decided to pack up and move Robert's whole family down to Arlington. That's where I was talking about earlier. I had to also find out the real animosity that was there that had continued from before the war, through the war, and after the war. Anybody who lived in the South and lived through Reconstruction felt like the government was just punishing them. They took it serious, and there was a lot of retribution about that. So I thought I felt like I needed to tell the story from historical perspective of those places, because it really does put it more in perspective of what was happening. Did Tom steal a horse? I don't know. I don't think so. Did he sell a stolen horse? Yes. Did the gunfight result in death? Yes. Was the death legally warranted? Well, yeah, it was. Really and truly, what we're looking at is really bad policing. If that kid would have gone and found Tom, went back to the sheriff and said, "Tom's right there," Tom would have got arrested and had to deal with the stolen horse thing. And those charges eventually got dropped because there was no evidence that Tom stole the horse. He even had a bill of sale for it. But because a gunfight broke out and because it was somebody that the town of Fort Worth knew, and in fact, the local paper labeled him as a deputy marshal, although there's no records in the actual city records that he was, there was a lot of animosity toward the Alfords. And that rolled from Fort Worth right into Arlington. And they had a really tough time as a family. Like I said, the girls had to marry out of that name. Elsie, the Robert's wife, moved back to Tennessee. And in 1887, Robert Alford was found with his head chopped off and an axe in his head.
Oh, my.
The newspapers report that it was some local Mexicans that he had hired that did this, but it's the same Mexicans he had put in front of the door to guard because he knew that his life was in danger. So Dad and I speculate, I got no evidence of this whatsoever, that animosity continued on until Robert's death.
Well, that makes sense. It took a long time for that to go away.
In many ways, we're still dealing with it.
Yeah, yeah. Back to your book, you decided to put this out on Amazon, which is such a great way to self-publish. So much better than back in the day when you had to guarantee a payment to the publisher for 500 copies and then try to sell it to all your family. So.
Yeah, and you end up with a closet full of books. So I didn't write the book really to sell to the public by itself. It's really, I used it to distribute to the family. Now, anybody could buy it. Anybody could read it. I think it's worth a read, but that's my personal opinion. We really used it to help distribute it to the family. And if you use KDP, Amazon self-publishing, and you do it right, you can do it without spending a dime with Amazon, because Amazon prints these books on demand. They'll make money if you sell 100 books. They'll make money if you sell one. So if you're willing to put the time in and upload the files and they pass, they don't care if you sell it or not. I mean, they're going to spend a lot of time trying to get you to market it, and they're going to spend a lot of time trying to sell you editors and ghostwriters and that kind of stuff. But if you know how to write a research paper and you know how to write your family story, you can put it in your words and, source your own things. And your book doesn't have to be 500 pages. It could be 30 pages, and you can still get it published and be able to distribute it to your family.
It really is a great thing, and it's so easy for people to order, and it gets delivered right to their house. You don't have to do anything.
And it gives the family something tangible,
Right.
something to put on their shelf. And anybody in the future that wants to look back and see this is why Dad wanted to do it in a genealogical way. We've got everything sourced. You can go look at it. You can decide whether the evidence is real or not. But we made it easy for whoever looks at it in the future to find out where we got it.
Right. That's so great.
I love that. We used Amazon KDP to publish our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA. And I have often wondered maybe this could be used by other researchers, just like you've done it. So thanks for sharing
Yeah.
how you distributed it to your family at little cost and just such a great, easy way for people to find it and order it. So let's dive into the DNA now. So, what did you notice with the DNA evidence when you first started looking at that?
Before we asked for professional help with Diana and Michelle, Dad had submitted to Family Tree his Y-DNA, and he did fall into the haplogroups of many Alfords, including one, Jack Alford, who turned out to be the grandson of Robert Alford, Patrick Alford's brother. I know there's a lot of Roberts, but that's in Patrick's generation. When we got the advice from Diana to use autosomal DNA, it was a game changer, because we could take that and look at through lines on Ancestry, and we were connected to a lot more Alfords. Many of them connected to Robert Alford's brothers, many of them connected to Robert Alford's father, and some of them connected to Robert Alford's father's father. So that really solidified a name change.
Wonderful. It's so great to hear that all of the documentary evidence lined up perfectly with what you saw in the Y-DNA and autosomal DNA and how you were able to piece that all together. What did you feel the need for hiring a professional genealogist do?
Yeah, that's a good question. Dad and I have tossed around the idea of getting credentialed, but I kind of have a job and a family and things to do, and I don't want to ruin a good hobby by trying to do it for a living. But having a professional to overlook your work and give kind of a stamp of approval goes a long way. And the reason it does is it's not just me and my dad saying these things anymore. We've actually had people that are trained to look at it, agree with the research. And then you can use that professional stamp of approval to join, social groups like the Sons of Union Veterans. Those guys ask you to show their DNA line, and you either have to have a lineage of father that had fought in the Union, or you would have to have your father's brother or his wife's brother fight in the war to join. And as it stood now, I'm a Johnson. And then if you go back my line, it'll stop at James William Johnson, who came onto the map in 1885, and there's nothing before that. And that's where Patrick Alford stopped being on any documentation. So it's very difficult to go to those groups and say, yeah, there was a name change here, without somebody else saying, yep, there was a name change here. So it's very helpful. And it also helps the family finally come to grips with that there was a name change. And as I said earlier, Dad and I, being estranged from the Johnsons, we were emotionally disconnected from that. It could have been any name for us, but it was the name that they knew all their lives, and were told that their parents and grandparents and their parents were Johnsons. So having a professional look at it and put a stamp of approval on it really made it much better for a lot of the family.
Yeah, and I remember when I first talked to you and your dad, it was so fun to hear the story, and I was excited about, working with one of our researchers, Michelle, on this. And it was such a fun project that I actually asked her to write a series of blog posts kind of showing how she did it. And so, listeners, you can go read those blog posts about her process of taking this great story. And you can imagine kind of the challenge of taking these years of research and adding DNA to it, and then having to put that into a report that anyone could read and have all the source citations and have everything in an organized format. So it's really neat just to think back on this project. I loved it, and it was fun working with you and your dad and Michelle in doing this. And we are going to have Michelle on in a podcast coming up where she's going to talk about how she put all of your research into a good form so it could be shared and you could use it. So
it was a really nice report. We were super excited.
Yeah, and we'll share that with our readers and listeners if you want to go find that. So thank you so much, James, for coming on and telling your story. I never get tired of this story because, I have some of those Texas ancestors too, and Arkansas ancestors and Tennessee ancestors, and we actually have a gunfight in our history, and, so I really relate to all of this. I don't have the name change thing, but it's just been such a pleasure working with you and your dad and doing this project with you and really learning more about your family. So thank you so much for coming on and telling your story.
Well, thank you, Diane. Thank you, Nicole. And we really appreciate all the work you guys put in the research.
Well, that is what we do, and we love doing that. So thanks for being such amazing clients.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we're excited to talk to you next time. So have a good week, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our online courses or study groups of the same names. Learn more at familylocket.com/services. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our courses. To get updates in your email inbox each Monday, subscribe to our newsletter at familylocket.com/newsletter. Please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. We read each review and are so thankful for them. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.